So it's Regina Vaidyanathan. Thanks very much to all of you who are joining us, whether that's early morning in the UK or whether you are joining us from India or anywhere else in the world. The discussion today is going to be looking at innovation and the future of capitalism. Now, from Adam Smith to John Maynard Keynes, economists have argued for free trade and the innovative power of capitalism to improve living standards and prosperity. Many governments support that rhetoric, but it's not always the reality. Almost all countries still impose widespread tariffs in order to protect their citizens. Should we give up the rhetoric or change the reality? Is free trade and innovation not the capitalist panacea, but rather the cause of increased inequality? Do we need to limit change to protect people? Or would global free trade enable developing countries and economies to thrive, create higher living standards for everyone, and unleash the power of innovation for everyone to benefit? There's quite a lot to get through, but certainly a very provocative topic, and we have three great speakers who are going to go through that with us. So let me introduce who we have. We'll start with Pravin Krishna, Distinguished Professor of International Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University. He served as a consultant to the World Bank and the IMF, prominent supporter of Indian Prime Minister Modi's liberalisation of India, although has recently cited concerns about Prime Minister Modi's government potentially backsliding into protectionism. Second introduction is Michael Howard, leader of the Conservative Party in the early 2000s, who also held prestigious cabinet positions in governments, including Secretary of State for Employment and the Environment as well, and of course as British Home Secretary. And last but not least, Prem Shankar Jha, a renowned Indian economist, journalist and writer who's worked at the United Nations and consulting on the UNDP. He was also information advisor to Indian Prime Minister VP Singh, and was a former editor of and the contributor to the Hindu newspaper, but also has written for many Indian publications. So there we go, a really distinguished panel to discuss things with us. Let's start by opening with a pitch from all our speakers, which looks at the central question. When it comes to trade, which goal is more important, Pravin Krishna? Is it greater prosperity or is it reducing inequality?
On the issue of international trade, let me say the following. International trade, first of all, has been a key driver of growth and poverty reduction. Parts of your question about inequality, I want to be careful in my comments to distinguish between poverty and poverty reduction, which acts on kind of one end of the income distribution, essentially what happens at the bottom of the income distribution, and rather different, perhaps the rich getting richer, while the poor may also be getting richer. And then what's the difference between the two? These are distinct concepts, and I think they need to be treated separately. But first, as far as just international trade and it being a poverty reduction, let's keep in mind the example of China, a stunning example of a country which has been able to draw hundreds of millions of its citizens out of poverty with a growth model that was largely based on technological change and international trade. And much the same is true in India, where we also have seen large reductions in poverty in the 2 decades after India began its market reform. So poverty in India, maybe about 50% in the 1970s, early 1980s, is down to about 20. It's a very significant reduction in the context of international trade, once again, and market reforms. And indeed, no developing country, one could argue, has achieved kind of high and sustained levels of growth without participating substantially in international trade. And by and large, with the growth that's come with trade and kind of market reforms and so forth, have been impressive reductions in poverty and indeed improvements in all of the human development indicators that we would be concerned with. Now, it is definitely can put some jobs under threat, and even if it is the case that most economists believe that technological advances really contribute far more to job losses and dislocations, especially if you low-skilled jobs than trade. But nevertheless, one should keep in mind whether it's technological change or trade. For instance, when the automobile was first invented, it was bad news for blacksmiths and horse breeders and so forth. The electric light was problematic for candle makers. but these created millions of jobs in the automobile sector and the lighting sectors. So some level of dislocation, some inequalities may be to be expected with trade and innovation. And if these turn out to be significant and severe, then it's of government, suitable policies, adjustment assistance, reskilling of workers, maybe even the introduction of policies in a gradual manner to support such change.
Okay.
The last thing I'd say very quickly, should inequality get out of hand, rich get very substantially richer as a process of openness and globalization, surely there are other mechanisms like just income taxes rather than protection that we could rely upon as a government to limit that.
Thank you very much for that. Let's go to Prem next. So 3-minute pitch. What's your take on this?
My pitch is quite simple. I may even take less than 3 minutes. I think that the important thing is we need to distinguish between a free market and free trade. Free markets are inside a country. Free trade is freedom of markets between countries. Basically, what competition does, a market economy does, of course, as you know, it promotes efficiency. And the most innovative, the enterprises come on top. But this competitive market is itself a sort of a passing thing, because the competition itself wipes out the weaker, and the numbers left become smaller and smaller. And eventually, if you look at all the mature capitalist economies of today, they are oligopolies. There is just no free market. That's the honest truth. The fact is, the free market today is a myth. What is free, however, is that in the domestic markets, you have the capacity, the state has the capacity, and the workers have the capacity to, in fact, make sure that the benefits from the increased productivity and efficiency of competition do get passed on to the workers. And Britain is an excellent example. I don't need to go any further, but the whole of continental Europe and to a considerable extent the US are all in this category. Free trade is between countries, and that today is a complete free-for-all. And that does not necessarily lead to greater prosperity in the poorer countries. Yes, okay. One last point. Yes, it is true that East Asia and Southeast Asia benefited from free trade, but they benefited even more from the transfer of technology to these countries in order to enable them to be able to trade in the goods that the West needed.
Okay, thank you very much. And last but not least, Michael Howard, what's your pitch?
I think we're really trying to build a conflict where it doesn't exist. There's no necessarily conflict between prosperity and equality. As has been pointed out, as Pravin pointed out, free trade and capitalism have in the last quarter of a century led to the greatest reduction in poverty our planet has ever seen. And we don't celebrate it enough. And that couldn't have happened without capitalism, and it couldn't have happened without a considerable degree of free trade, because the countries in which the greatest reduction in poverty has taken place have been able to improve the condition of their people through free trade. But I do also agree with Prem that the internal market it does have a tendency towards oligopoly, and that countries should impose much more vigorous competition rules to curb the oligopolistic tendency. Competition is the lifeblood of capitalism. Competition is the key to capitalism. And if competition erodes, then capitalism doesn't work properly. And governments have a really important role to play in fostering competition and curbing monopoly power. Just over 100 years ago, an American government was able to take very radical measures to deal with the lack of competition in some of its key industries, oil and railways in particular. And I think we need much more vigorous competition policy in today's world to deal with some of these monopolies.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's start with that first theme.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.